At first, the height felt like theater. Old train stations rose above the street with vaulted ceilings, towering windows, and iron spans so immense they seemed designed to humble the traveler before a journey even began. That is the explanation repeated in guidebooks. Civic pride, industrial confidence, architecture as spectacle. But the deeper I looked, the less that answer held. The most excessive height was not always where the public admired it. It appeared above platforms, in covered sheds, in working spaces where ornament meant nothing and cost meant everything. And that raises one question. What was that height for? It starts with a visual contradiction, so familiar that most of us stop noticing it. A train station is supposed to move bodies from one place to another. It is a machine for arrivals, departures, schedules, tickets, luggage, waiting, and control. And yet some of the great stations built in the 19th and early 20th centuries do not feel like machines at all. They feel ecclesiastical. They rise overhead with the confidence of sacred architecture. Their interior volumes suggest procession, reverence, awe. The first instinct is to call that symbolism. Cities wanted to impress. Rail companies wanted prestige. Empires wanted their gateways to feel monumental. All of that is true, to a point. But it does not explain the full scale of what was built. Because the strange part is not the facade. The strange part is the working height, the vast interior air above the tracks, the iron and glass sheds stretching over platforms like enclosed weather systems, the clearance above locomotives, the roof lines that soar not only over passenger halls, but over the operational heart of the station itself. If this were only civic theater, you would expect the grandeur to stop where utility began. A grand entrance, perhaps. A ceremonial booking hall. A proud exterior facing the avenue. But again and again, the height continues into spaces where no one needed to be impressed. Spaces built for smoke, heat, noise, soot, signaling, loading, and movement. That is where the official explanation art starts to weaken. Look closely at the great terminals of London, Paris, New York, Antwerp, Milan, Budapest. The same pattern emerges with unsettling consistency. Immense glazed vaults, iron ribs spanning extraordinary widths. Platform sheds so tall, they seem designed for an atmosphere rather than a room. You can call it ambition. You can call it industrial beauty. But beauty at that scale is never cheap, and these were not ornamental follies built for private fantasy. They were expensive transport machines, funded, engineered, and maintained under hard practical constraints. Every extra foot of height meant more iron, more glass, more structural load, more cost, more labor, more complexity. In working infrastructure, excess demands justification, and still they built upward. The usual answer is that the railway age thought big. That is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The 19th century admired scale, certainly. Bridges expanded. Factories widened. Exhibition halls stretched. Civic buildings grew theatrical. But admiration alone does not explain repetition under operational pressure. When the same expensive spatial choice appears across different nations, different companies, different political systems, and different urban contexts, it begins to look less like taste and more like requirement. Not decorative grandeur, functional volume. The question, then, is simple. What requirement? Steam offers the first clue. Before diesel and electrification changed the railway environment, major stations were not clean places. They were breathing chambers for engines that arrived trailing vapor, smoke, cinders, heat, and chemical residue. A locomotive entering a covered shed did not merely occupy the track. It transformed the air. Hot vapor climbed. Smoke accumulated beneath glass. Soot settled into surfaces. Noise reverberated. Visibility shifted. Ventilation became a live problem, not an abstract one. Under those conditions, vertical space stops being luxury. It starts to look like a buffer, a reservoir, a survival mechanism built into the architecture itself. But even that explanation may be smaller than the buildings suggest, because many of these stations do not look merely tall enough. They look overwhelmingly tall, tall beyond what casual mitigation would seem to require, tall enough to absorb not one train's exhaust, but the repeated exhalation of entire schedules, tall enough to hold heat and turbulence well above the heads of passengers, tall enough to separate the human zone below from the industrial atmosphere above. Once you stand beneath one of those roofs and imagine it filled with steam-era traffic rather than preserved heritage lighting, the space reads differently. Less like a decorative shell, more like a machine for managing conditions. And that changes the meaning of the cathedral. Comparison. Maybe these stations resemble cathedrals, not because they were imitating sacred architecture, but because vast enclosed volume was the practical solution available to engineers confronting a transportation environment far harsher than the modern visitor can easily imagine. The resemblance may be real, but the cause may be backward. We assume symbolism first because symbolism flatters culture. It lets us believe the builders were dramatizing progress. But builders responsible for infrastructure usually do not spend fortunes dramatizing anything unless the drama also solves a problem. There is another detail people miss. The disproportion appears not only in the central hall, where spectacle can be defended, but in the transitional spaces around it. Approaches, concourses, platform canopies, iron spans beyond the formal civic front. Again and again, the station remains vertically ambitious after the tourist perspective ends. And that matters, because architectural symbolism is usually concentrated. It performs toward the city, toward the visitor, toward the image a nation wants seen. Function, by contrast, repeats itself in the parts no one photographs on purpose. These buildings were photographed constantly, yet the real mystery was hiding in plain sight above the trains. Consider what that means in practical terms. Roof height affects airflow, condensation, daylight diffusion, heat accumulation, maintenance access, signal visibility, even the psychological management of crowds. A low shed would have trapped the railway's violence closer to the body. A higher one diluted it, lifted it, displaced it upward. The volume itself became part of the station's operating system, as real as the rails beneath it. It mattered. The more examples you line up, the less comfortable the standard story becomes. One station might be exceptional. Two might be fashion. A handful might reflect national pride. But a continental pattern of enormous rail interiors, built at enormous cost for systems obsessed with timing, throughput, and engineering efficiency, points towards something more grounded than civic ego. Something operational, something measurable, something the structure itself once answered so clearly that no explanation seemed necessary at all. Now it does, because we inherit the shell without inheriting the conditions that made it logical. We walk through restored terminals under cleaner air, thinner traffic, altered equipment, simplified narratives. We see romance where earlier generations saw necessity. We admire the height because we no longer have to depend on it. And that may be the first serious mistake. When a building continues to look excessive after the world that shaped it has vanished, the excess may not be symbolic at all. It may be evidence of a reality we no longer remember well enough to describe. That forgotten logic becomes clearer when you stop treating the station as a monument and start treating it as an environmental device. The railway terminal of the steam age was not simply a container for passengers. It was a chamber built around heat, combustion, scheduling pressure, and mechanical force. Engines arrived breathing fire into enclosed urban space. Carriages unloaded crowds into air already thick with residue. Metal roofs expanded and contracted under temperature strain. Steam condensed against glass and iron. Every departure renewed the cycle. In such a world, height was not empty. Height worked. This is why the old explanation feels so thin. To say these stations were built tall for prestige is like saying a lighthouse was built tall for beauty. Beauty may follow. Symbolism may gather around it. Cities may turn utility into identity, and identity into civic pride. But first, there is a problem, and the architecture answers it. That is what these stations begin to look like when you strip away nostalgia. Not theatrical excess, but spatial engineering on a scale so large that later generations, no longer needing the same solution, mistook necessity for ornament. And once you recognize that possibility, a second question emerges. Were these roofs designed only to vent smoke, or to manage an entire operational world that we now underestimate? Because the old stations did more than shelter trains. They synchronized crowds, freight, timetables, class segregation, baggage systems, signaling sightlines, maintenance access, and weather control under one enclosure. The great height above the platforms may have absorbed the byproducts of steam, but it also created room for visibility, circulation, suspended structure, and tolerances that smaller buildings could not easily provide. The station was not a room with trains inside it. It was an artificial atmosphere wrapped around movement. That may be why the surviving interiors still produce such a physical reaction. People enter them and instinctively slow down. They look upward. They lower their voices. They describe them as sacred because the body reads scale before the mind explains it. But what if that reaction is partly the echo of function? What if the awe was built into the station because awe and order once worked together? Vast overhead volume does not merely impress. It regulates behavior. It organizes lines of sight. It turns dense traffic into something legible. It makes a crowd feel small inside a system designed to contain it. And that is where the historical memory starts to flatten. Modern descriptions often compress all this into broad phrases. Grand civic architecture, triumph of industry, gateway to the city. Those labels are not entirely false. They are simply incomplete in the way labels often are when direct experience disappears. They describe appearance better than cause. They tell us what the station looked like to later observers, not what it had to do for the people who built and operated it under daily steam conditions. We keep the poetry and lose the pressure. You can see the same flattening in preservation culture. Restored terminals are lit beautifully, cleaned carefully, narrated elegantly. Their ironwork becomes artistry. Their vaults become heritage. Their scale becomes atmosphere. But preservation often arrives after the operating logic has been stripped away. Electrified lines replace smoke-belching locomotives. New ventilation standards alter experience. Passenger patterns change. Service areas are closed, repurposed, or hidden. The station remains, but as a softened fossil. We admire the bones while forgetting the living system they once supported. That is why these buildings can feel excessive to us. We measure them against present use instead of original demand. We compare their height to modern concourses, modern emissions, modern circulation, modern expectations of efficiency. And by that standard, yes, they can seem almost irrational. But irrational for us does not mean irrational for them. It may simply mean we are standing inside a solution, designed for conditions we no longer inhabit, reading its scale with the wrong assumptions. There is something unsettling in that realization. not because it proves a grand hidden conspiracy, but because it suggests how easily function becomes myth once the world that required it disappears. First the necessity fades, then the explanation simplifies. Then the surviving architecture is reclassified as symbolism, style, ambition, romance. Eventually, everyone repeats the new story because the old one no longer feels intuitive. The building is still there, towering overhead, but the reason for its shape has been translated into something safer, flatter, easier to display in guidebooks. So, when we ask why the stations look like cathedrals, we may be asking the wrong question. The resemblance may be real, but resemblance is not purpose. Perhaps they did not borrow sacred scale to glorify the railway. Perhaps sacred scale and railway scale converged because both had to solve the same ancient architectural problem: how to create ordered human experience beneath overwhelming volume. One served ritual, the other served machinery, smoke, and mass movement. Both needed height to turn chaos into structure, and the next question follows naturally. If even something as visible as a station's height can be misremembered within a few generations, what else in the built world are we still describing decoratively when the real answer was functional? How many old structures appear grand only because we no longer understand the pressures they were built to contain? How often do we stand inside inherited space, admire its beauty, and miss the vanished reality that made such beauty necessary in the first place? The stations remain. Their roofs still hang above platforms like weather held in suspension. Their iron spans still suggest confidence beyond modern caution. Their height still feels like an answer, even when the official explanations sound like captions written after the fact. We pass through them, photograph them, restore them, praise them, and call them cathedrals of rail. But maybe that phrase survives because we can sense that the scale meant more than image. Maybe somewhere inside that enormous air, the old logic is still present. Not as nostalgia, not as style, as evidence. Evidence that these buildings were shaped by conditions more intense than the ones we remember. Evidence that utility, once forgotten, can harden into mystery. Evidence that the modern world often inherits forms it no longer fully knows how to explain. And if that is true, then the height above those tracks is not a flourish. It is a clue to a harsher railway reality, a larger operational imagination, and a past that still stands over our heads while we pretend it was built only to impress us. The structure still remembers what we forgot.